As we get going today, I want to remind you of a couple of things. First, the final is coming up on April 27th at 10 o'clock for the face-to-face class. We'll meet in this room, but make sure to be preparing for that. If you have questions about the study guide as you're preparing, feel free to get in contact with me about that. Secondly, as I've noted before, if there's any work that you need to turn in to submit for the course, you have the opportunity to do that as long as it is in by April 23rd. So if you have any final quizzes to finish, or if there's something else that needs to be done, make sure to complete that by April 23rd. Also want to let you know that the student evaluations, the evaluation forms have gone online. You should have received an email in your email about that. I would greatly appreciate if you took the time to fill that out and give an honest assessment of the course, places that you thought worked, places that you didn't think worked as well. And if you would complete that, that would be very helpful to me. We have just a few things to finish up with the 20th century before beginning to talk about today, and then on Monday, the 21st century. And when we move into the 21st century, we'll talk a little bit how we're going to approach that slightly differently than what we've been doing. We are in the midst of talking about changes that occurred in Christianity in the 20th century with respect to practice and how Christians approached the actual living out of Christianity. In the latter part of the 60s, a sizable segment of young adults became very disaffected with mainstream American society. If you think about, if you think back to maybe some of your history courses or just a general knowledge, there's so much that happens in the latter part of the 20th century. The Vietnam War, as well as how the American government approached that. A rejection of the conservative style of their parents, the connection between Christianity and American imperialism. All of these led to a lot of people in their young adulthood being very disaffected with a lot of American culture. You see during this time period the rise of what are known as the hippies. And the hippies often evidenced this kind of rejection of the customs of society. So the other thing that was going on in this time is these alternative lifestyles, the use of drugs, sometimes the use of drugs for attempting to engage in spiritual experiences. The idea of these altered conscious states might involve some sort of spiritual experience. Some older Christians, looking at the development of this kind of culture, sought to minister to these people, and others within the hippie lifestyle were often concerned by the lack of spirituality in the movement, or the rejection of Christianity. And so out of this, you have the rise of the Jesus movement, or the Jesus people. Often, many of the people involved in this try to take some of the elements of the hippie lifestyle, communal living, the rejection of formalistic church practices, really tried to strip down Christianity in a sense, using less theological language, putting concepts in a common phrase, saying things like, Jesus is all right with me. Right? Not a very theologically deep sentence, but something that was in the language of the people of the time. A lot of this started in 1967, the so-called Summer of Love, particularly out in California. One of the major people involved in the early parts of this was a minister named Chuck Smith. And in 1967, he started Calvary Chapel. In 6 months, the membership grew from, or the attendance grew from 200 to 2,000. During this time, there were hundreds of teens baptized in the oceans, beach baptisms, about once a month, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people looking to be baptized. And they're coming for all sorts of reasons. They're coming because they're burnt out on drugs. They're coming because they've run away from home. Pregnant teens would be drawn to these people. Sometimes it was just regular middle-class, rule-following teens looking for something different. They were sometimes referred to as street Christians because a lot of their evangelizing was done on the streets or on beaches. But they were also referred to as the Jesus people. Essentially, Jesus people encompassed three different groups. The first group were often the Jesus freaks. Often the Jesus freaks were the ones that were the hippies. They had the hippie-like long hair, walked around in bare feet, always wore the smiling face, and tended towards that communal living. The second group of people were often youth from church organizations or parachurch organizations like Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Young Life, Youth for Christ. People in colleges who had encountered these organizations but didn't really like how formulistic a lot of church worship was. And a lot of the people that joined Campus Crusade or InterVarsity were often very disappointed in the denominational aspect, the fact that there's so much infighting between denominations, or some of the ways in which church life was. And then finally, the third group that were encompassed in the Jesus people were people that tended to favor a charismatic approach. But these were very successful movements, especially places like California, where it started and eventually spread out elsewhere. You would have these large conversions, sometimes even including celebrities. Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash both claimed conversion during this time period. Very important for a lot of activity in Southern California was the conversion of a man named Lonnie Frisbee. Chuck Smith had encountered Frisbee, who was a hippie at the time, had been involved in all sorts of religious groups, religious movements, spirituality. But eventually, between the discussions between the two of them, became a Christian. Very charismatic as a leader, very popular as a speaker, but also charismatic in his approach to Christianity, claimed the ability to be able to heal, to prophesy, to speak in tongues. But he also had, for the Jesus people, the credibility of the hippie lifestyle, the hippie look. Often wore long hair, had a deerskin robe or cape he kind of wore that had a painting of Jesus on it. And you can find some of his preaching at Calvary Chapel on YouTube, for example. And the one line that kind of really struck me that summarizes a lot of where Frisbee was coming from is God is blowing everybody's mind because he's saving the hippies. And so this is what he really sees going on, right? This God is, he's far out, dude. He really is changing the way everybody thinks because he's saving the hippies. And so that calm, laid-back, hippie type of lifestyle. But it wasn't just new preaching styles or a new way to interact with people that's coming out of this movement. Frisbee and Smith both believed that what was very important for this group was not just a laid-back approach to worship or a more active role Frisbee and Smith decided that not only would these changes need to be made, there was a necessity to have new worship styles as well. And so at Calvary Chapel, they started a variety of what we might call folk rock groups with Christian lyrics with a Christian message. Starting a record label, Maranatha Music, And one of the most popular groups to come out of that was a group called Love Song. They had started out as a nightclub act, actually, and they had tried a variety of different religions, had been involved in drugs, all sorts of things. But eventually Smith had convinced them to become Christians. Once they become Christians, they're very active singing at Calvary Chapel, produce a record that does well, sells well throughout the world. In fact, it becomes the #1 record in the Philippines, of all places. Other bands started at Calvary as well. There would even be free rock concerts started at Calvary. And so often this style of music was referred to as Jesus rock, using rock and roll style with religious lyrics. One of the most successful of the early Jesus rock artists was a man named Larry Norman. And Norman made the comment one time, supposedly based on something Martin Luther said, though I'm not positive about that, why should the devil have all the good music? Essentially the idea of any style of music should be available for Christians to use. There was not any style of music that was a problem. What was needed, though, was appropriate lyrics. Now, we're talking about a time as rock and roll is beginning to undergo changes, and so there's a lot of opposition to rock and roll from other mainstream Christians. Norman had grown up a Baptist. He hated hymns, just did not like that style of music. Played in a variety of rock and roll bands. Was offered a contract with Capitol Records at the age of 18 for a group known as People, with an exclamation point. And they became fairly successful with a positive message. They toured as the opening act for groups like the Grateful Dead, the Doors, and even Jimi Hendrix. When the group breaks up, he eventually starts preaching on the street and performing as a solo act, and becomes very prolific, very successful as a musician. Not only does this have an effect on this kind of popular level of music, it also evolved into changes within church music or worship music itself. The praise chorus or the worship song was something that was a new style of music towards the end of the 20th century. There were a couple of characteristics that made up these types of songs. Often very simplified lyrics. Were very few, often repeated. It was often the same couple of lines repeated over and over. And frequently the emphasis was on emotional conceptions of God or relationship type of imagery. As with other expressions of the Jesus movement, Jesus rock was eventually mainstreamed into what today is known as contemporary Christian music, or CCM. As pop music has modified, so has CCM. So that if you listen to the CCM of the 1970s and you listen to CCM today, you hear the 1970s, you hear the millennial sound. Often, like the worship song, CCM focuses on emotional conceptions, relational language, sometimes masking some of the more explicit religious language in general phrases. Instead of saying, "I love Jesus," saying things like, "I love him." Now, what's the difference? Well, for the person that knows the message, they know what they're talking about, but by doing that, it's made CCM at various times more marketable. And so from the 80s through the 90s, even up to today, you see a variety of artists that are crossover artists, mainstream people. And so they have these kind of innocuous songs in the sense of there's not an overt expression of religiosity, but underneath it there is a level of spirituality, a level of commitment to Christ or to God. In the 80s and 90s, in the 80s it was people like Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith. In the 90s it was groups like Sixpence None the Richer, Creed maybe. Creed has always tried to eschew that label. More modern times you have groups like Switchfoot, who kind of have found some success in both places. But one of the things that has really changed in the late 20th century and into the 21st century is that many of the recording companies that were original Christian recording companies have often been bought by mainstream groups, and they might still have the label of Word Music or another type of publisher, but they're owned by like Time Warner. They're owned by some other groups that are secular companies, but they have these religious divisions. Questions about the Jesus movement or contemporary culture, contemporary Christian music. Last area I want to talk about with respect to changes in practice in the 20th century has to do with children and the focus on children. Now, certainly, children have been important in the history of Christianity throughout its history. I mean, if you think back even to the feeding of the 5,000, it's a child that provides the bread and the fish for Jesus to feed the 5,000. And certainly and certainly children throughout the early Christian centuries were important in other places as well. But in the 20th century especially, there are quite a few different changes that occur with respect to children. One of those comes from within Catholicism. In the late 19th and into the early 20th century, Catholic thinking about children began to reflect more Protestant ideas, specifically ideas of children as being spiritually innocent, children as being spiritual guides, that you look to children for what it means to be a Christian. And we talked in the 19th century about how there was a Marian apparition to a young girl, Bernadette. And a lot of the so-called Marian apparitions were to children. In the 19-teens, Pope Pius X began to argue and encourage children to have more involvement in the spiritual life of Catholicism. One of the ways that he encouraged this was by lowering the age of First Communion. Previously within Catholicism, you did not take communion or the Eucharist for the first time until you were about 11 or 12. But Pius X said if they've reached the age of 7, it's too late. Right? And so he wants to lower it even down to ages like 5 and 6. Children were reflections of the mirror image of God, said Pius, and a lot of Catholics agreed, believing that you could get a glimpse of God's character when you looked at children. They were channels for God, and they were channels for goodness. He encouraged religious instruction even at a young age, like 4 or 5. Now, again, up to this point, Sunday schools had largely been a Protestant phenomenon, and so there wasn't that young education in Catholicism, and so Pius says we need to be educating children earlier. But on the other hand, and so there's this language of children being innocents, being guides, they need to be instructed. On the other hand, children acted like children. So there was a lot of attention by both Protestants and Catholics on regulating children's behavior. And so Catholics produced instructional manuals on discipline, right? How do you discipline your children? And so, manuals on physical discipline. And within Protestantism, you have James Dobson and Focus on the Family, perhaps being one of the most famous groups in the 20th century, to provide instruction on guiding your children, disciplining your children. Dobson produced books like Dare to Discipline, The Strong-Willed Child, books like Bringing Up Boys, and then a couple years later, Bringing Up Girls. And so there was a lot of focus throughout the 20th century on raising children, how do you appropriately raise them, how do you discipline. Another development related to children in the 20th century was the creation of children's worship. Now, it's kind of unclear when this exactly started. And it would be something distinct from Sunday schools. But by the end of the 20th century, it was common for most Protestant denominations and non-denominational groups to have a separate worship service for children, while the adults were in a regular worship service. Now that might be just a period of time, or it might be an entire worship service just for children. Such a practice served a few purposes: to introduce children, instruct children in the faith, instruct them on their own level, versus sitting in with the rest of the adults and the preacher is preaching to the adults and everything's over the child's head. Children's worship also was meant to teach children how to behave in a worship service. And then finally, it of course served the purpose of getting disrupted children out of the adults' worship space, right, by putting them in a separate situation, and so the adults could focus on the service. So we have new thinking about children, new worship practices about children, and then a new development of material culture directed to children. Material culture products, media, toys for children in the 20th century. Now, religious toys have been around for quite a while, but a lot of changes in the latter part of the 20th century. And perhaps the most famous of this is the development of VeggieTales, which started in the 90s. Maybe you've heard, probably most of us have heard of VeggieTales. If you hadn't, the idea here is that there are these are computer-animated, anthropomorphized vegetables. And so they act, they're living, they act. People like Bob the Tomato, Larry the Cucumber, Junior Asparagus. When it started out in the 90s, it was essentially kind of a 30-minute show about biblical character, about a biblical character or character traits. A story about David, or it might be trusting in God, being a neighbor. Often they included humorous and sometimes pop culture references, but they weren't irreverent. And so you have shows like Josh and the Big Wall, the story of Joshua and the conquest of Jericho. Madam Blueberry, Where's God When I'm Scared? King George and the Ducky, which is based off of David and Bathsheba, but not David and Bathsheba. It's King George wants somebody else's ducky. Often the shows had no explicit reference to Jesus. They were very spiritual. They were created by evangelicals, but they didn't refer to Jesus often. And a lot of the focus tended to be on Old Testament characters. People like Joshua, people like David, Moses. And at the very end of every episode, viewers were reminded God made you special and He loves you very much. What's interesting about VeggieTales is not only this kind of using media to get to children, but also the success that VeggieTales had. That it wasn't just in Christian bookstores or in Christian markets, but copies of the videos and then the DVDs could be found in places like Walmart, Kmart, and Target. Certainly, we could also talk about a variety of other brand lines, some of which were popular and some of which weren't, some of which crossed over and some of which didn't. Brand lines like Bible Man. Anybody seen Bible Man? Okay, some of you have. It's kind of like Batman, but he's Bible Man, right? Often, many of those products tended to be explicitly Christian, which is why they didn't end up crossing over as much as something like VeggieTales, which was very spiritual, had a lot of Bible to it, but wasn't explicitly Christian all the time. Any last questions or comments about the 20th century practice? Anything to finish us there?